Alright, hello and welcome to ETeeski Tutorials. You are watching the Ultimate Game Dev Tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to learn how to take your models made in Blender and bring them over into our video game engine. And in this case, we're going to be using Unity, or otherwise known as Unity3D, which is this program right here. So this probably looks pretty new and scary, and you don't know what any of this stuff is, and that is okay. We're just going to jump into it, and I'm going to kind of jump into it assuming that you know at least a little bit about Unity. If you don't know anything about Unity, and for example, if you're working with another game developer, like if you're part of a team and you want to give your models to the coder or the developer who is using Unity to make the game, like say you're creating the 3D models and he or she is creating the code and the level design and all of that stuff inside of Unity, even though the two of you have two distinct roles and you use two different pieces of software, I highly encourage both of you to learn both programs, at least to a degree. Of course, you're going to know one more than the other, but I really think that it's really useful to know a little bit about both pieces of software, so that just the two of you, or maybe the three of you, or however big your team is, can all work together a lot better, and you just know how to work together. And plus, there's still a lot of art things that you can do inside of Unity, such as playing around with lighting, playing around with shaders, playing around with textures, doing level design. There's a lot of artwork that goes into level design itself. So you can still learn a little bit about how to use Unity without having to learn any code at all, and you'll still be much better off than not learning Unity whatsoever. So if you're wondering where to start with Unity, or at least want to know what basics of Unity you should learn, at the very least, I would encourage you to watch Chapter 1 of this tutorial series, and that would be the, I don't know what I titled it, but something along the lines of Introduction to Unity, and that is going to be Chapter 1 of the Ultimate Game Dev Tutorial series. So I would at least encourage you to watch that. You don't have to watch it right now. You can go ahead and watch this tutorial first and then watch that tutorial series, whichever you prefer. So yeah, enough of me talking about that. Let me go ahead and just jump right into it. And some things might seem a little bit confusing because I'm going to be talking about Unity, or maybe you're one of the people who watched all of the Unity tutorials and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So either way, I'm just going to go ahead and just jump right into it. Okay, so whoops, wrong button. The first thing I want to talk about is the different ways that you can actually take what you've created in Blender. And as you can see, I have three different objects here. I have whatever that thing is, and this little like alien machine looking thing, and then these two ice cream cones and a little face guy with bulging eyes, or whatever the heck that is. And there are, well, I guess there's about three different ways that we can actually import these models into Unity itself. And the first way, I guess I will talk about actual exporting. Okay, so one thing I actually want to quickly do, and this is just a little side note, that was just a little test before I started recording the tutorials. I just want to delete that and get that out of the way for demonstration purposes. So let me go back to Blender. So anyways, the first way is actually exporting the models that we have in front of us using the export feature. And to do that, we just go to File and then Export down here, and then we have a couple of different options. I haven't tried out all of these, but I believe the ones that work best would be .3ds, .fbx, and .obj. Honestly, I don't use these too often, but I'm going to show you anyways, and I'm going to explain in a second why I don't use these too often. And between these three, I don't know, maybe a quick Google search will let you know the difference between these three, but honestly, I don't personally know how much of a difference it really makes. I guess if you're working with different 3D modeling software programs, like such as, if your friend on the internet is using 3ds Max and he or she wants to send you a model for you to open up and edit, but the only program you have is Blender, that would be a .3ds file. So vice versa, if you want to create a model and send it to your friend and your friend uses 3ds Max, you'd use a .3ds model, or whatever, whatever one of these types of models or types or file types that he or she uses. But for now, let's use FBX as an example for taking our model outside of Blender and bringing it into Unity. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on FBX. And as you can see, we have something that looks a lot like what we do when we actually save our model, well, when we're just like saving it as the .blend file to reopen later. So the first thing we're going to do is choose where we want to save it. And the first thing you're probably going to want to do is go over here to your drives. Chances are you'll be using the C drive and then users or wherever you just like to save your files. Go ahead and save it wherever it makes sense to you. Me personally, I think I'm using, the F drive. And it's going to be in that folder, that folder, that folder, and I guess I'm going to actually create a new folder for demonstration purposes, and I'm going to call this my Blender models. Whatever, you can name it whatever you want. So I'm going to stick it in that folder, and I'm just going to call this, I don't know, I'll just call this my example, and that's what I will name it. Alright, so I'm going to save it in this folder, and I have a couple of options down here. I can change the scale, and this is basically the way that 3D models work between game engines and 3D modeling software is that things are measured in units. And in your head, you can imagine those units as anything that you want. Like that unit can be a foot, or a meter, or a yard, or whatever length measurement that you prefer to use. Probably the easiest is going to be to use meters because it just works better with physics. And at least in Unity, the default unit kind of behaves as if they are meters, especially with the physics system. If that doesn't make any sense, I guess just know that, actually here, let me hit cancel really quickly and just zoom in and show you. Remember how I was talking in earlier episodes about X, Y, Z, like how this is, or wait, what direction am I looking in? Okay, so there's X, there's Y, and then Z is up and down. Remember how I said that, like this point right here would be 1, 1, 0, and this point over here would be 2, 1, 0, and we're counting over like 1, 2, 1, 2 on this grid. Well, those are units, and you can imagine those as any length measurement that you want. Personally, I usually imagine those as meters, which is approximately 3 feet if you're in the United States. Most people are familiar with the difference between meters and feet and yards and all of those different length measurements. So anyways, let me get back to exporting this. So I'm going to go to File, Export. I'll do an FBX. It doesn't really matter if you do a 3DS or OBJ, I believe is what it's called, whatever you would prefer to do. And let me go back to my folder that I wanted to do it in. Let's see, I believe it was over here, and I believe I called it, here we go, my Blender files. That's where I want to save it. And I want to rename this my example. Whoops, example, just like that. Enter to save that name. All right, and then some of the other options that we have is that we can rearrange what Z and Y are, and well, the up and forward, we can change those. And in ours, oh, do I gotta hit cancel again? I'll hit cancel again to explain this. But remember how I talked about how in Unity, Y is up and down and Z is forward and back, and how in Blender, Z is up and down and Y is forward and back? Well, we can swap those around when we're exporting our models. And in this case, since we're importing into Unity, positive on the X, which is that arrow pointing there, is right in Unity, so that is what we want. But in Unity, Z is forward, and as we can see in Blender, positive Y, where that green arrow is pointing, and you can see down there which one is X, Y, and Z, so green is Y. Instead of green being positive on the y-axis, we want it to be positive on the z-axis, and vice versa for the z-axis. We want y to be positive up, just like that. So we're really just going to swap those two things around. So I'm going to go to Export, FBX, rename this my example. Sorry that I didn't plan that out very well. You shouldn't have watched me do that like 3 different times. But anyways, so let's see. Forward, instead of negative z forward, let's change that to y forward. And up, we do want it to be z up. So that should be the orientation that we want. And I believe it looks like we can also choose what we want to export. And let me pull this over a little bit more so that you can read those. So we have to choose whether or not we want to export empty objects from Blender. We didn't really talk about that too much. I personally don't use that very often. Cameras and lamps. Those are useful if you're creating artwork for a video or an image that you're just creating straight out of Blender and that's it. But inside of Unity, most of the time it won't matter about these. I would leave those off. But the 2 things that you really want is armature and mesh. So far we're just using meshes. Later on we'll talk about armatures. Those are useful for animation. And let's see, do you hold down shift? Yeah, hold down shift and then you can click on it and then you can select which one of these you want to export. In this case, I'm just going to do mesh, or you could probably just leave them all on if you want. It's really not going to hurt anything, but it might simplify things if you just export the parts that the game developer or the game programmer is actually going to use. And in this case, it's just going to be mesh, and in some cases, it's also going to be armature. So I'd say in most cases, if you don't know and you want to be safe, I would do empty, armature, and mesh, and you should be good. And probably just leave the scale as 1, and that will also be fine. And that's something that we can edit in Unity, or our game developer can edit inside of Unity. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So, and there's other settings that we can play with, but for the most part, I would just leave them all default, and I think that all of those will work well just the way they are. Oh, one other setting that I want to talk about is selected object. So if we uncheck selected object, it's going to export everything. But if we check selected object, it's only going to export the objects that we had selected when we press the button export, whatever file type we have. In this case, it's FBX. So in this case, I want to uncheck selected objects because I want to export everything. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit export, and let's see, what did it say? It gave us a little warning here. I'm not really sure what that warning means, but oh well, let's see if it worked. So what I'm going to do now that I exported it is I'm actually going to go into my, wrong file. That's not what I wanted to do. I want to go to, let's see, I believe my file is somewhere around here. There we go, my Blender my Blender models. There is my file right there. So I opened it up inside of File Explorer, or if you're on a Mac, that is called Finder, but basically just the way that you find your files on your computer. So another way you can get to this is going to your Start menu and then going to Computer, and then there's a bunch of other ways that you can get to it as well. Just simple standard computer stuff that you've probably used outside of Blender and outside of Unity3D as well. So anyways, enough talking about that. Here is our Blender file. It's myexample.fbx. So there's our file. It's good to go to be imported inside of Unity. And I guess I'll show you 2 different ways that we can bring this into Unity. So I'm going to open up Unity. Here's Unity, and I will show you the first way. The first way is we can go to our assets folder, or whatever folder that we want to import this into. So I can either click on here, and then our file will import into here. But actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Create, Folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called Models. There we go. And I'm going to open up that folder, and then I'm going to click on it, right click, and I'm going to go to Import New Asset. And this window is going to pop up, and it is going to let us go around and explore the files and choose what file we want to import. And we know that we saved it inside of my Blender models, and there it is, myexample.fbx. So let's select it, click on import, and voila, there it is. And as you can see, there's everything. And oh, it looks like I actually got the orientation wrong. Let me click on the model there. Yeah, as you can see in this little preview window, I'm going to press spacebar to make it bigger. As you can see, I actually looks like I got it backwards, but that's not actually the end of the world. Our programmer can just our programmer can change that inside of the game itself by just rotating the object. So it's not that big of a deal. And if I drag and drop this into our scene, well, you can see that the scale, if I press F to zoom in on it, you can see it's also very, very tiny. So one thing we can actually do, is we can go to our project window, select my example, and as you can see, the scale factor is really, really small. So let's set that to 1 because we know that we changed the scale factor to 1 because we were talking about meters, and in our video game here, 1 unit we're pretending is 1 meter. Because this guy is about 2 meters tall, which is about 6 feet tall, which is the height of your average adult person, sort of. But anyways, so now we're going to hit apply, and you'll see that our model has changed to more of the size that we were thinking of when we modeled it. And let's see, let's zoom in, just check out to make sure the model looks good. It does, and actually if I look over here, there's the other parts of the model. So if we want to rotate it and fix it, we can either re-import it again, or we can just simply rotate it like that. And there you can see our game object has been rotated, and we can move it to where we want. And there it is, very similar. Let me press spacebar to make that bigger. Very similar to what it looked like inside of Blender, except now it's inside of our video game engine. And one thing to note, remember when we were talking about modifiers inside of Blender, as you can see, the modifiers have been applied. So this is like all one solid object now. It's no longer like a mirror that we can go back and edit anymore or anything like that. It's just that solid, that solid. Well, technically it's not solid yet because we didn't put any colliders on it, but you know, all of the meshes, all of the points that you see are real points in 3D space. We can click on this one over here, and as you can see, that smoothing modifier that we applied is now all of those little points that were a result of that smoothing modifier have been applied, and those are now all real 3D points in 3D space. So there is that object. And as you can see, when I click on these are all separate objects that I can click on and I can move around individually. And one thing I want to show here in the hierarchy, you can see that it says my example. Remember, that was the name of the file that I exported it as. And then when I open this up and see the other meshes, you can see they're all individual meshes that we can move around or we can rotate, and we can do whatever we want with them. But whoops, cancel. One thing is that they're named kind of weird. Like, you know, we should name this architecture thingy, and we should name this one alien machine thingy, and we should name this one smiley face with ice cream cones thingy. Or, I mean, those are ridiculous names, but you get what I'm saying, is that we should have named them something that actually made sense. Whereas in this case, it says cube, cube 001, and sphere. Like, those are kind of weird names that aren't very descriptive of what they actually are. And the reason why they're named that is because when we first created this one, remember we created it as a cube and then we expanded on it from there. Well, it starts off with the name cube, and it won't change that name until we change it. And this one here, remember, we also started off as a cube, but it named it cube 001 because there was already a cube in there, so it wanted to name it something different. So that's why I said 001. And if we created another one after that, it would be 002, and so on, and then 003, and then it just keeps on counting up from there. And then this one is named sphere because we started off with a sphere and then we manipulated that sphere to make it look like this with our modifiers and our, you know, all of that stuff that we created. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this and I'm going to redo it again. And I'm going to show you how to do this again, but name things a little bit better. Oh, actually, before I do that, let me, well, first I'm going to delete this my example out of here. Yes, go ahead and delete it. And I'm going to show you the other way that we can bring that file into Unity. And these aren't all of the methods, but these are probably the two most common ones. So I'm going to bring up my file inside of File Explorer or Finder if you're on a Mac. And here's my file, myexample.fbx. And Unity is so great. It's so simple. All I have to do is drag and drop that into there. So I'm just going to take that, drag and drop it into there, and it is imported and inside of our video game just like it was before. So that's pretty awesome, right? So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave that there just like that. And I'm going to go back to Blender and I'm going to show you how to rename these files. Okay, so the place that you go to rename these files is actually going to be renaming the object. And if you rename the mesh, well, it's kind of weird because that doesn't have any effect inside of Unity. You can go ahead and rename it inside of Blender if you want to for yourself for organizational purposes, but really, I don't think that's that big of a deal. I don't think you really have to do that. I think it will work out much better to just rename the object. So I'm over here, I'm inside of my, I believe it's called the Properties window. So I'm inside of my Properties window, I go to that little tab that looks like a box, and I go down here where it says Sphere, that's the name of it, and I'm going to rename this Smiley Face. Even though it's not actually, he doesn't actually have a mouth, he just has eyes. But anyways, that's just what I'm going to rename it, just as an example. And I'm going to press period to zoom in on this guy. And I'm going to rename this Alien Machine. So I'm going to go over here. And I believe I can also, can I click inside of here? Will that work? Can I right click? Oh, I can right click and I can go to rename. That's another way that you can do it. I'm going to call this Alien Machine. I hope I spelled that right. I'm kind of horrible at spelling. So I renamed that one, and as you can see, it also changed down here inside of our properties window. And now I'm going to rename this one as well, and I'll just rename this building thing, just like that. I'll just rename them like that, and there we go. So now I have all of my objects renamed, and now they should have those names when I bring them into Unity. So I'm going to go through the export process again, and for example's sake, let's go ahead and use a .3ds file. It looks like we have different options for our .3ds file, but that is okay. Let's see, I'm going to actually... I'm going to show you one more way that we can just bring this directly into Unity. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to export this into the Unity file of our project itself. And in this case, if I go up, you can see here is my folder. Here's my Blender files. But actually, I want to go to Ultimate GameDev Project. Double click that. I want to go into Assets, and there's all of the parts of our video game, all of the files for our video game. And in this case, I want to save it inside of the folder called Models. And you can't see it right there, but this is the folder where the .fbx file was, the myexample.fbx. It's in there, but you just can't see it because we have it set to .3ds right now. So if we had another .3ds file right here, we would see that. If that didn't make sense, don't worry about it too much. That wasn't really that important. So anyways, I'm going to rename this myExample2. And let's see, let's change, let's see, I believe I must have gotten these backwards before, where we want forward to be Y forward and up to be Z up. And, well, I guess sometimes you just got to do trial and error with different file types. And honestly, I'm going to show you one more example of how to bring your files into Unity that personally for me work best, and you really don't have to worry about those. So I guess that's just one of those trial and error things. But know that if your object is rotated in a weird way when you bring it into Unity, either you can just let the programmer deal with it, or, if you are the programmer, deal with it yourself, or, you can fiddle around with these settings and export it again. So I'm just going to leave those as they are, and I'm going to go ahead and hit export 3ds. And there we go. It should be exported. So now let's go back to Unity. And as you can see, it's automatically in there. My example 2. And, well, that's the placement of all of this stuff is a little bit strange. Let's drag this into our scene and see what it looks like. I'm going to zoom in on it. And yeah, I don't know why it placed those things all weird. I guess sometimes that just happens depending on, whoops, wrong button. I need to press F because I'm inside of Unity now. I guess sometimes just depending on what file type you export these as, sometimes things can be weird and in different places. So just sometimes you run into those problems. But in my experience, exporting it as a .blend file works the best, and that's what I'm going to show you next. But before I get into that, I just want to show you the naming of these different files. And once again, we can also go into our project window and change the scale factor if we want to. Like if we want to change it to 1, hit apply, and there we go. Now these things are more the size that we were thinking of when we were modeling it. Let me click on that again, move that. All right, so anyways, as you can see, now we have my example 2. That's the name of the file when I exported it. And then we also have alien machine, and it cut it off because I guess my name was a little bit too long. Building thing and smiley face. So because I renamed the objects, now they are renamed inside of Unity. And also when I go to my mesh filter and go over here, they're also named, well, you can see from the first my example, here's a list of all of the models that we have in our project files. As you can see, we have the old ones that were named sphere and cube, but we also have smiley face, building thing, and alien machine. And I believe if I go here and I delete my example, and then I go back and check out my mesh filter, click on this little circle to see everything, the old ones have been deleted, and now we only have alien machine, building thing, and smiley face. So renaming your objects can be very important, and just for mostly just organizational purposes, it can really help out the programmer or the video game designer, the person who is using Unity. It can just be really helpful to do that so that they can just find the files that they're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and I'm also going to delete that. I did that because, well, I don't really like those methods. I guess, they're good to know because every once in a while you might need to know how to export in that way. And I guess that's probably the standard way. But I'm going to show you the way that I really like to use and I think is just a lot more useful. And that way is just saving the .blend file into the Unity project. It just automatically works, and Unity will recognize that .blend file as if it's any other model file, and in my experience it works really well and you run into a lot less problems. And because I guess it's maybe the Unity engine or the Unity company noticed that a lot of people use Blender and Unity together, they decided to make those two work together very well. So it works very awesomely when you just save your file as a .blend file and use that instead of the exporting process. So I'm going to keep everything the way it is, where I have everything renamed, building thing, smiley face, alien machine. I'm going to keep those all just the way they are. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control-Shift-S, and I can save this wherever I want. I can save it directly into Unity, into our Unity project files, or I can save it into another file and import it in the exact same way that I showed you earlier. So I guess in this case, I'm going to save it directly inside of Unity itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to find the folder that I want to save it in. And as you can see, it's going to be inside of Ultimate GameDev Project, Assets, Models, and that's where I want to save it. and I'm going to rename this. Whoops, I want to make sure I keep that period in there because it's got to be period blend or dot blend, and I want to put my name before that. But I'm going to rename this my example 3, and I'm going to hit enter. And there really aren't too many options to deal with. Mostly it's just where do we want to save it, and everything else in here. I guess, I don't know. I don't usually ever play around with those, so you can play around with them if you want, but I usually don't ever use them. So anyways, I'm just going to hit save as blend file, and we should be good to go. We have this saved, and now if I go into Unity, you can see there it goes, my example 3, and there it is. It's oriented in the correct way. They're all spaced out in the correct way. And if I drag this into our scene, it's all the correct size. And because I renamed my objects, they're all named the correct thing. And I really like the way that, I mean, it puts a little underscore in your name instead of a space, but that's cool. That works perfectly fine. And it keeps the full length of our name, and there's our file name right there. And if we go over here, we click into here, and you can see there's the name of all of our different things. And we can change our import setting, and automatically has a scale factor of 1, which is usually what we want. And you know, it has all the settings really good. There's not really much we have to play with because, well, it all looks really good and it all works really well. So that is why I really love using a .blend file. And I'm going to show you one more reason why I really love using a .blend file. And to show you how this works, I am actually going to go to Blender, and I'm going to exit out of it. So Blender is closed. I no longer have it minimized. I just exited out of it. It's completely closed. And it doesn't really matter if it's closed or open. I'm going to show you something that's really cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my example 3 file right here. And I can do one of two things. I can just double click on it from right here, or I can right click on it and go to show in Explorer or show in Finder if you're on a Mac. And as you can see, it has my .blend file right here, and I can double click on it right here, but that's also the exact same thing as double clicking on it right here, so that might be a little bit faster. And then once again, we can also do the right click, import new asset, or we can just drag and drop the file into Unity itself. Those are both excellent ways of bringing the file into Unity. But one thing I want to show you that's really, really cool is that let's say, you know, I go here and, you know, I look at this and I go, I want to change that. I want to make his eyes a little bit bigger. No problem. I can just go here and double click on it, and it opens inside of Blender, and here's my Blender file, and everything was exactly the way it was. If I go to tab into edit mode, you can see that it is still mirrored. I still have my mirror modifier, and I can you know, adjust it the way I want. And if I want to make his eyes a little bit bigger, I can go there, I'll select that. I pressed Control plus on the numpad, and then if I hit S, that will make his eyes bigger, and as you can see, his eyes are definitely bigger. I'll make them even bigger just for demonstration purposes. Now his eyes are really big. And then I go there, and I can either save this as a new file, or I can just simply, well, let me go over here and click on this thing down here so that you can see what keys I'm pressing. I can just press Control S and then save, and it will save over it. And now if I go back into Unity, there it goes. It just automatically updates, and let me click on that so that you can see now the eyes are bigger right inside of Unity, and you can just edit the file right there just like that. And that is one of the best reasons why I love using .blend files, is because a lot of times you go in and you import the model and you're like, ah, darn, I really want to change something. And well, there you go. That's what you can do with a .blend file. So, you know, when it comes to other game engines, I'm not familiar with all of them, of course. But let's say you're using the UDK engine, or the UE4 engine, or the Crisis engine, or, you know, the Frostbite engine, all those different engines. You know, with those, it most likely will be a different import process. And sometimes, you know, maybe it doesn't like using a .3ds file. Maybe it only accepts .fbx files or .obj files and all of that stuff. So, you know, sometimes you'll be limited to those. But at least when it comes to Unity, you can just save it as a .blend file, and you can edit it later, and it's just super, super useful. So that's why I would highly encourage just using a .blend file and just saving it with the Control S, or excuse me, the Control Shift S. So yeah, I guess that pretty much summarizes how you can bring your files from Blender into Unity. But before I end the episode, I want to talk about a couple of other things, and I just want to look at my notes to make sure I went over everything. Oh, I guess one thing I want to talk about is the center point of a game, or of a model. I want to talk about these center points. So if I, for example, I click on this, and you can see if I want to set this to pivot, and I'll set that also to local just so that you can really see. As you can see, my little move tool, it looks very similar to the one that is inside of Blender. And if I set this to pivot as opposed to center up here, we can see the center of this object, or this model, which is actually 3 models. But you can see my center is actually over here because, well, I set that to pivot, which means that like when you set it to center, it's going to average out where everything is and kind of calculate a new center. But when we set it to pivot, it's going to change it to the true center, which is over here. And you really want to focus on the true center because that is where you're going to like rotate around. So if I rotate this around, you can see it's rotating around that point. And that's very important when it comes to video games. Because let's say, you know, the programmer for this for this video game, let's pretend that this is a character, you know, and our programmer wants to rotate around the y-axis when our player presses left or right on the keyboard or joystick. Well, if we code it just the way it is and leave this just the way it is, it's going to rotate like that, and that might not be what our programmer wants. Our programmer might want to rotate around this point over here. And same goes for the models on the inside as well. And all of these, for the most part, have a pretty good center point, but I want to show you what the center point looks like inside of Blender. And really, it's just a little orange dot, which is that little orange dot right there. If I go to Tab into Edit Mode, that little orange dot represents the center. So if I take everything in here, and let's say, whoops, that kind of was weird because of the mirror modifier. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit apply, or no, actually what I'm going to do, oh wait, I just go out of edit mode and then hit apply. There we go. And now the mirror modifier has been applied. So anyways, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this way over like that. And as you can see, my center point is still right there. So 2 things I want to explain. I'll hit tab and I'll go to another game object to show this. So I'm going to select that, press period to zoom in on it, and then, whoops, I'm going to hit A to deselect it. So see that little orange point? That little orange point is the center of this object right here. And if I select this one over here, that little orange point is the center of this object right here. And if I go back and select this point, remember how I moved it way over? Well, the center point of this object is right there. So if we rotate this object inside of Unity, it's going to rotate around this point. And same with inside of Blender. If I'm going to rotate this object inside of object mode, as you can see down here, so if I hit R, as you can see, it rotates around that point. So that may not be what we want. So that's just something to be conscious of. To, you know, like if we want this to rotate, you know, around this point, well, let's move this model to that point. And that's how that would work. So that's how the individual models themselves work. But the center point of all 3 of the models together, where inside of Unity, remember where it said my example. Oops, let me press W. There we go. You can see I have that set to pivot because remember, if you have it set to center, it's going to calculate a new center, not the real center when you have it set to pivot. So if I have it set to pivot, there you can see there's the center point right there. And then if I go inside of Blender, there's the center point right there. As we can see, that little grid. So that shows the center point of everything. So let's say I want to move this around. I want to move that, closer to the center. I can do that. And once again, because I'm using a .blend file, I can just hit Control S and save it, and it's going to automatically update inside of Unity. So that is really awesome. And as you can see, the center point is still there, but this is now closer to the center point because I moved it to that point inside of Blender. And whoops, let me go back to Unity, and you'll see that, well, when I have this object selected, the parent object, and I rotate it, it still rotates around that point. And then if I go to my smiley face, you can see, remember how I moved it way over? Well, my center is right there. And when I rotate it, it rotates around that point just like that. So that's something to be conscious of, to understand how that center point works. It might not make a big difference to you as the artist, but if you're giving this model to the programmer or, the video game designer, the person who is using Unity, it can make a really, really big difference to them, and you can save them a lot of hassle. And oftentimes, communication is key for communicating, where you want the center point to be. It could be in different places depending on, how the video game is programmed. And, if you make a mistake, it can be fixed by the programmer, and they can, create a parent game object, and they can edit some things and change where the center is using a couple of tricks. But honestly, a lot of times it can save a lot of hassle if you just get the center point right the first time, or communicate with your game designer and, ask them where they want the center point to be. So that is how the center point works. And I guess the next thing I want to talk to you about is, I guess I don't want to show too much about this, because later we're going to get into UV mapping and making textures, and we're definitely going to be talking about this a lot more in later episodes. So if you do want to stop the episode now and practice everything that I just showed you in this episode, that's awesome, and you can move on to the next episode and be totally fine. But just to give you a heads up, I want to talk about textures and materials and exporting Unity packages, which I do talk about more in the chapter 1 of this tutorial series. So if you want to go back and learn the Unity basics, I will talk about this in chapter 1. But one thing I want to talk about is, as an artist, typically you are the one, you are the person in this video game development process who has the eye. You're the one who is making, or the programmer is making everything behave and move and play the way that is fun, or, whatever, however they want the video game to be. But you're the one who's going to change how this video game looks, the visual appearance of this video game. And a big part of that is textures and shaders. And to edit a texture and shader, like let's take this one, for example. Here is the shader over here. And we can put the texture in here. And actually, let's go to our materials, and I guess the only material we have is unnamed material. I guess we can take some of the materials from an earlier chapter, so I'm going to go in there. I'm going to go to my koala material. It's super ugly, but I'll just use this as an example. I can either take this material and I can just drag and drop it on there, but as you can see, it just turned it a light green color because, well, we don't have any UV mapping on there yet. We don't have any information about how to cut apart this texture and put it onto here, so it gives like a solid color. But I can edit this texture and I can change it to, say, specular. And as you can see, now it's a little bit more shiny. It has a little bit of a shine to it, and I can change the amount of shine. And this is something that you might want to play around with. You might want to change, whoops, let me pull this window over here so you can see it. You might want to change the color of the shine. Maybe you want to make it like a blue shine, so that now when we look around, it has this like blue shininess to it. Or maybe you want to add a bump map to it, which I can't really show you for this example. Well, I guess I can show you over here on the ground. I'll create, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to duplicate this material, and I'm going to call this, I'll just rename this bump, and we're going to change this to a bump map. And what we need for the bump map is we need a normal map. And we're going to talk about this in later episodes, so I'm just going to duplicate that, and I'm going to change this from texture to normal map. I'll keep all the default settings, and I'll hit apply, and now that's a normal map. And whoops, let me go back to my materials. My koala material bump, and I'm pretty sure I spelled koala wrong, or maybe I spelled it right, I don't know. But I can change this to say bump specular, and then I can go to my texture and take that normal map texture, and as you can see, now it's bumpy. So if I take that material and put it on there, and then I can also turn off that light and move this light around, and now you can see the bumpiness of that. See how it has that like 3D bump to it? So those are like different things that you can play around with. You can play around with them in Blender, but in my experience, it's a lot more effective to play around with these things inside of Unity itself, because you can really see what it's going to look like in the video game itself. And honestly, that's what counts, because you can create an image that sort of represents what the game might look like inside of Blender, but because of Blender, it's very geared towards creating images that take a long time to load, but they look photorealistic. But that's not actually going to translate into our video game engine, because our video game engine, it can't take a long time to load all of these images, because it has to load these images like 30 times a second or 60 times a second, upwards to 120 times or maybe more times a second. So it has to render them very, very, very fast. So it's just going to look different. So when you're playing around with the textures and the materials, play around with them inside of Unity or whatever video game engine you're using. Play around with them inside of the video game engine, because that is what they're going to look like in the video game itself, and use your artistic eye to make them look awesome. And then you can take your files that you've created inside of Unity, and you can take your files that you created inside of Blender, such as your models. Like, let's say, I created this texture, and I'll hold down Control to select models, and this model. So these three files, let's say you created these three files. Oh wait, I forgot the material. I need to also select the bump material. So these 4 files, let's say you created these 4 files and you made them look exactly the way you want them to look with your artistic eye, and you want to give these files to your video game programmer so that he or she can then take those files, now that they look awesome because of you, and put them into the video game, and they will focus on making the game play awesome. I'm just using all of these examples as if the artist and the programmer are separate people, but of course you two can be one person. You can be both the programmer and the artist for a video game, and this is still good information to know. But anyways, let's say you get these 4 files exactly the way you want. You can then right click on them and go to Export Package, and let me move this window over so that you can see them. You have this export settings, and I talk about this more in chapter 1, but you can also, I would select include dependencies just to be safe, and your programmer can get rid of whatever files he or she doesn't need after they import this themselves. So you can select the files that you want by selecting them in here and then going in here, or if you just hit export package, you can find all the files. You'll see a big list of every file. I guess I'll actually show you. If I deselect those and then just right click, export package, you can see there's all the files for the game. Actually, is that all the files? No, let me select the assets folder, then hit export package. There's all the files, like all the scripts, all the scenes, like all the technical stuff. So you can either deselect them and then just go in and select just the ones that you want and then hit export, or you can find your files, which I had them here, let's see, here, and here, and I believe those files were this one, this one, this one, and this one, those 4 files, and hit right click, export package. There's our files. We have the one selected. Go ahead and just leave that include dependencies checked just to be safe, and then hit export. choose where you want to export them to. Like let's say we want to export them just in here, and let's call this awesome art for the coder, and go ahead and hit save, and it's going to export those, and there you go. There's the file, and you can just email this file or Dropbox this file or put it on a flash drive and give it to your programmer, and they can then import this file into the game and take your artwork and actually put it inside of the actual video game itself. So yeah, and we're going to get more into all of this later. We're going to learn more about materials and bump maps and textures and UV mapping. We're going to learn a lot more about all of that later, so don't worry about that for now. Yeah, so I guess that pretty much summarizes everything that I wanted to talk about in this episode. I was hoping this was going to be a shorter episode, but I guess I wanted to cram a bunch of information in here so that you would be fully prepared for the future, because, well, the more you know, the more you can do. So in our next couple of episodes, we're going to be taking all this information that we learned, and we're going to start actually creating some real things. No more just random shapes that make no sense. We're going to create some things like a desk. What are some other things? A locker, maybe a chair, maybe a couple of other things. Actually, I think those are the ones that we're going to create. But anyways, we're going to be creating some real objects that we're going to actually import and use in our video game. So we're going to get rid of this randomness that we've been using so far. So yeah, that is what we're going to learn next. And also later on in this tutorial series, we're going to learn how to create some characters and some animated characters that are actually going to move. And we're going to make them like move and run and jump inside of Blender itself. And that's called animations. And that's where that armature thing came into play. But we're going to talk about more about that all later. So yeah, I guess that was this episode. Feel free to play around with this stuff. Practice importing and exporting these files. Maybe go back and watch that chapter 1, learn the Unity basics, so you know more about how to manage these files, because the more you know about a video game engine, the better you're going to work with the other person who's using that video game engine, because you know more from their perspective of what they want and what you should give them. And you just learn the little things, and also you can help out with editing the artwork inside of the engine itself and making the level look really cool. And maybe you want to be a part of the level design. Maybe the video game programmer is going to create what the level needs to be. Create like the puzzles or the level layout, and then you can go in and then you can use your artistic eye and put bushes or buildings or things that don't affect the gameplay and just make everything look better. So yeah, feel free to play around with that, because practice makes perfect when it comes to art. There's no substitute for practice. It's just one of those things. The more you practice, the better you get. And no tutorial is ever just going to teach you everything. No tutorial is ever going to just, substitute practice. So you gotta practice. So the more you practice, the better your art will become, and you'll start to develop your own style and learn your own techniques. I can teach you some of my techniques and some of my own thought processes, but and some of the tools that I use, but a lot of it's just so abstract and it's so hard to put into words, and it's going to become the same way for yourself too over time. You're just going to develop on your own as an artist. So practice, 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 see what you can create. And in our next couple of tutorials, we're going to use some real examples and create some real things that we're going to use in our video game together. So yeah, I guess until then, I will see you later, and keep making games.